air coolers lately has actually gotten really interesting. We have even more interesting ones coming up after this too, because they have finally gotten to a much cheaper price point where higher end dual tower designs that are actually efficient and not just brute forcing their cooling have come down closer to the $60 to $70 mark. We saw that with the Scythe FUMA2, really overall good cooler that we were happy to recommend. And now we're looking at the Deepcool AK620. This one has done well too in testing thus far. It is a direct competitor to the FUMA2, so that's your direct alternative, and it comes in cheaper than the NH-D15, normally anyway. Now, the last time we looked at a Deepcool product, it didn't go so well for Deepcool. Our biggest challenge for Deepcool in that one was simply evaluating whether the marketing was full of lies. And it was for the Assassin 3, where Deepcool claimed that the heat pipes were sintered and grooved, or what commonly is referred to as a composite, but instead they were just sintered. It was kind of a weird thing to burn your entire reputation over, because the end result is not actually that different. But when we cut the heat pipes open, which apparently Deepcool thought no one would ever do, we saw that the marketing wasn't even close to being defensible. So this is our first time looking at another Deepcool product since, and we are much more hopeful for this one because the marketing has been dialed back a lot on the claims. Before that, this video is brought to you by EVGA's X570 Dark motherboard. The EVGA X570 Dark is a high-end motherboard for AM4 CPUs, built around extreme overclocking and tested heavily by EVGA's Kingpin. The X570 Dark has a uniquely rotated socket and RAM layout, 90-degree rotated cables for ease of installation and management, and tons of troubleshooting features to make building, testing, and overclocking easier. Check out EVGA's X570 Dark high-end motherboard at the link in the description below. So this cooler doesn't do anything fancy with marketing. It's a straight shooter. It's a dual tower cooler. It's got two 120mm fans, and these fans are new for the AK620. These fans specifically are called the Deepcool FUMA2s. Oh, you pronounce the letters individually. These are the FK120s. I thought you were supposed to sort of pronounce it as it was written. But anyway, this is a $70 MSRP. We've seen it for about $65 on Amazon, but we've also seen it bouncing around in price a lot. Third-party sellers commonly sell it for $90. At that price point, you're in direct competition with the NH-D15, which is now very old. It's starting to show its age, but it also shows how well it was built when it first came out. This is much better value at $60 to $70. We'll review it from that perspective, but we'll talk about what to do if it's above that as we get towards the end here. Direct competition we're mostly going to be drawing comparisons to will be the Scythe FUMA2. It's about a $60 cooler. It's two fans as well. We'll be looking at the Assassin 3 previously, and we'll be looking at a couple of the NH-D15. We'll look at one or two of the liquid coolers in here as we go. And of course, the charts have the usual 10 plus coolers on them if you want to pause them and look at your own comparisons. So the AK620, in terms of marketing, it doesn't do much, which we think is good, because this is a relatively simple product that can stand on its own merits pretty easily if it has them. It advertises a 260 watt capacity. Quick note on this, cooler companies all measure that number a little differently. Some of them will use a dummy heater, which is perfectly fine, but it means that you can only really draw comparisons within the same company's product stack. So if Noctua, for example, they don't really do this anymore, but if Noctua or maybe Deepcool or whoever claims 260 watts on one product and 200 watts on the other, within their own family of products, you can compare which is better that way, but you wouldn't be able to say Deepcool says it can do 260 watts, this other company says it can do 200 watts, therefore Deepcool is better. It's not that simple. And also, that number doesn't necessarily correlate to the TDP of the CPU, as you've seen in our Intel pieces where we talk about tau and boosting, and AMD pieces where we talk about the disgustingly complex formula for determining TDP, which doesn't have power anywhere in it. So just wanted everyone to be aware of that as you go into this. The numbers we care about are the ones that go into the actual CPU that's being used to generate the heat. Enough of that, let's get started with talking about the mechanics, the installation. We'll go through thermals, pressure, surface flatness, and more. Let's talk about the mechanics and the design of the Deepcool AK620 a bit. This is a large dual tower design. It measures at 129 millimeters wide, it's 138 millimeters long, and the height is 160 millimeters. Now this height is a disqualifying factor for fitting into a lot of the truly mid-tower ATX cases or some of the smaller mid-towers, but it's no problem for obviously the larger full towers and some of the larger mid-towers. So just be careful when you're choosing your case. A lot of them cap out at 150 to 155. There's a 47 millimeter RAM clearance with the front fan installed, so it'll be compatible with most memory modules without taller heat spreaders. Without the front fan, there's 55 millimeters of clearance, but this comes at the cost of performance. The fans are also able to be adjusted upwards in the case of RAM with tall heat spreaders, which is a feature we expect to see on a cooler like this. So you can still accommodate the taller RAM, but then you'll lose one, some efficiency, and two, you'll push obviously the cooler closer to the side panel, which may be a problem for you. The FK120 fans are only available on this cooler and range from 500 to 1850 RPM, plus or minus the normal 10% variance. The fans also have a soft rubber square on each of the corners, which is used to contact the heatsink and the fan clips to reduce vibration and noise, especially noise transmission through those small clips. The AK620 also features a unique checkerboard heatsink pattern on the front and the back. This doesn't do anything for performance, it's just purely aesthetic, and it helps differentiate it from other coolers. It's visually interesting though, we do actually like this overall, and it shouldn't clash with any PC styles. Of course, you also won't really be able to see it in most computers, depending on the type of computer you're building, but a standard layout is probably going to be sort of jammed in the back corner. The plastic covers on the top of the heatsink, on the other hand, are visible in most computer designs and give the cooler a clean, uniform, and squared appearance when looking at the top of the cooler. Mike on our team, our cooler technician who ran these tests, finds the design to be, quote, beautiful and a welcome departure from the more industrial look we sometimes see. Just because this is subjective, I'll throw my own opinion out there too. I do prefer the industrial look, and I like systems that are so functional that they look functional. So obviously it all just comes down to what you prefer, and we'll leave that up to you if you like it or not. This section will explain installation. If you're not interested in this section, skip ahead a chapter and you can always return to this if you buy it. We'll start with Deepcool's AM4 mounting. The first step is to remove the stock plastic brackets from the top of the motherboard. The AK620 utilizes the AMD backplate, so there's no need to remove it. Next, take the 4 knurled standoffs with the black plastic on the bottom and screw them into the backplate, which then secures them to the motherboard. These bits of plastic help prevent damage to the motherboard that could cause shorts if they were to scratch it. Next, place the motherboard brackets provided by Deepcool in the respective orientation, which would be C for AM3 and D for AM4. Then fasten the brackets to the standoffs using the knurled nuts by hand, and then consider tightening with a screwdriver, but don't go overboard. Once you've applied the pre-included thermal paste, place the cooler on top of the IHS and then secure it with the 2 captive nuts attached to a bracket that goes across the top of the cold plate. Using a Phillips head screwdriver, you can secure the spring-loaded captive fasteners to the brackets. These may require some pressure to begin threading though. You can also loosen the plate that the captive fasteners are attached to via the solitary screw in the center of the cold plate, just to circumvent having to compress the spring into the fasteners with an uncomfortable amount of force. Once you've started each fastener, tighten them both down, alternating, as always, every couple rotations until they stop. And don't forget to retighten that center one either. This mounting solution is easy to install, so that's a big plus, and it allows for consistent mounting pressure, which we'll see later. The fans go on last with somewhat standard wire mounts and attached to a 4-pin Y adapter connector. You could also, of course, connect them to the motherboard if you prefer. As for Intel LGA mounting, the procedure is the same, except you have to use their supplied backplate, from Deepcool that is, for the 1000 series sockets. Everything else is the same here. For packaging and documentation, the Deepcool AK620 was pretty great overall. All the hardware was accounted for. This seems like a low bar, but not every cooler passes. More importantly, there's no unnecessary single-use plastic in play, with Deepcool instead opting for reusable plastic bags. This is something we like to see because it reduces waste, makes packaging a little easier if you're going to repack it as well. The rest of the packaging was similarly functional, with lots of supportive cardboard and foam, even having cutouts for the fan clips to be safely secured. Our mounting pressure scan across the IHS is next. We test using a chemically reactive paper and a special, expensive NIST traceable scanner that was made possible through all of our supporters on Patreon at patreon.com/gamersnexus, and those who buy our products, like our 10-piece teardown toolkits, our HUD red and black mouse mats, anti-static mod mats, and other items from our GN store at store.gamersnexus.net. Thanks to all of you for making these tests possible. This test primarily evaluates the pressure from the mounting mechanism rather than the flatness of the cold plate, which we'll look at that part next. The Deepcool AK620 has some interesting results here. Deepcool advertises that the AK620 has a convex cold plate, meaning that it's curved slightly outward or down towards the IHS. With both the 3950X and the 3800X, the AK620's mounting pressure was centered in the middle of the IHS. In both tests, we saw less pressure on the left-hand side of the IHS with heavy contact dead center. In fact, in the 3950X test, you can see a dark spot right over the center of the IHS, which is where, well, it's right between the three dies. The mounting pressure of the AK620 is consistent across the middle, with Deepcool's convex cold plate design being clearly visible. This lack of pressure across the top and bottom can work okay, especially for a cooler that's handling a smaller IHS or a relatively moderate heat load, like AM4 or LGA 1200 options, because the heat pipes still make good contact over an area where the dies are located. This would be much less efficient and potentially problematic as a design on Threadripper style parts, which really need that surface area to be leveraged to cool the high and distributed heat loads caused by those CPUs. But for the AK620's market, this actually works really well. Our next test looks at the surface flatness of the cold plate. This is done with an extremely precise needle and from a known 0 point, measured in microns delta from that 0 point. The test allows us to see the consistency of the surface, helping to identify craters or manufacturing defects. The Deepcool AK620 ends up with a range roughly outside of the average, where the point-to-point depth variation averages 13.5 microns for the AK620. For reference, many of the other coolers we look at are 7 to 10 microns in average variation in depth point to point. Overall, this result is fine. It's nothing incredible. It ranges from 3 to 39 microns, so this places it around most of the other coolers in our data set, but it's not really ahead. It's also not far behind. Overall, the results are, at best, average. Time to start thermal testing. We'll begin with our noise-normalized 198-watt heat load with an overclocked AMD R9 CPU. This test is representative of most post-Tau Intel K-SKU CPUs and overclocked AMD R7 and R9 CPUs, which should be within the capabilities of the cooler. As a reminder, Deepcool claims a 260-watt capacity for this, but the way they measure that means really nothing. We don't know what they're comparing it to. There's a lot of different ways to take that number. The Deepcool AK620 will be under the most stress here out of all of our tests, but given the dual tower nature of it, it should be able to handle it. Here's the chart. At 35 dBA, the AK620 comes in at 57 degrees over ambient, which would place it in the high 70s to low 80s when factoring in our room temperature. Of course, it's not cold for a CPU under load, but it's well within the acceptable range for normal operating temperatures, and there's room to scale a little bit if you have a bad case or just dust over time. Compared to other dual towers, this places the AK620 at 2 degrees cooler than the Deepcool Assassin 3, 3 degrees cooler than the Scythe FUMA2 at a similar price, and within 2 degrees of the aging Noctua NH-D15. Compared to AIOs, of course, the best of those still hold a significant lead, like the Liquid Freezer 2 360 at 51 degrees, but they're also generally a lot more expensive. Unless you're getting scalped on the AK620 for $100, but don't do that. One final note about performance, we tested the AK620 with and without its top plastic covers. We were mostly just curious if they might be trapping a significant amount of heat, since some of the heat actually a lot of the heat comes off the top of the heat pipes as they protrude from the top plate. In this test though, they just don't cover enough surface area to make any difference, so there's no statistically significant change here, and they're not hindering performance in any meaningful way. You can leave them on. We will give credit though for just how easy they are to remove. That's a big upside, is ease of maintenance. The next test is our 100% fan speed benchmark on the 198-watt heat load. This test evaluates each cooler's maximum cooling performance under strain, allowing coolers to run at full fan RPM. Coolers with more powerful or just more fans can stretch their legs here, but they're typically louder. We mark the dBA level and the line names to help identify which coolers are more efficient, so that would mean better performance at a relatively lower noise level than the competitors, or less efficient. And as always, we use the included fans for all of the testing and all of these charts. In this case though, they're just set to 100% speed. Here's the chart. At 100% fan speed with a 198-watt heat load, the AK620 is at 54 degrees Celsius over ambient and 42 dBA at 20 inches distance. This is only 3 degrees cooler than our 35 dBA noise normalized test, while being 7 dBA louder. As a reminder to the human ear, a 10 dBA increase is approximately a 2 times increase in perceived noise. So this is a significant and noticeable increase in the perceived volume. Not quite at 2x, but it's approaching it. And just for the record, a 3 dB change, although doubling in acoustic power by some measurements, is not really the relevant measurement for human hearing. In this test, the AK620 directly ties with the Assassin 3. Compared to the FUMA2, the AK620 runs 6 degrees cooler. That's thanks to its higher RPM. The FUMA2 caps out at 34.4 dBA, so it's limited in its ability to scale up for higher heat loads. The FUMA2 is a good cooler, but the AK620 allows some additional headroom, obviously at the cost of noise, to scale with hotter CPUs or with overclocking if you're willing to increase the fan speed. Up next, we're looking at a 123-watt Heatload with an AMD R7 CPU. This test is representative of R7, non-K i7, and K-SKU i5 CPUs. As before for this test, there's no change at all to the hardware other than to set a 35 dBA system noise level in our noise-controlled lab. And if you'd like to know more about our lab, go check out our GN Extras channel, and especially our video of Mike walking through the acoustic test booth. We have one of these really cool acoustic chambers coming online as well for testing soon. Here's the chart. At 35 dBA, the Deepcool AK620 comes in at 55 degrees Celsius over ambient under load. This places it at the same level as the Assassin 3 and the Scythe FUMA2. Because this load isn't as intensive, the coolers end up much closer together than in the 200-watt test. The law of diminishing returns comes into play here. Competing dual tower coolers like the FUMA2 and the NH-D15 run at about the same thermals, making all three roughly equal options in this test, except the pricing, of course, of the D15 is still higher. The eSports Freezer 34 is also a very close competitor and worth considering, at least for sort of the 120 watt and lower options. The EKAIO 360 liquid millimeter cooler is only really being referenced here because of the super high-end alternative. This is only about 3 degrees cooler than the AK620, and the reason for that isn't because liquid cooling doesn't work better. It's because at these lower heat loads, the limitations of the air coolers don't start to come into play as hard. So the liquid cooler, like the EKAIO, scales far better for hotter CPUs and has more headroom to deal with 200 watt plus loads. Up next is the same test, but at 100% fan speed, regardless of noise. In this test, the 620 is within the margin of error between the Noctua NH-D15 and the Deepcool Assassin 3 at 53 degrees Celsius over ambient for the 620. However, we need to consider the efficiency since they're now at max noise, and that's not controlled anymore. The AK620 was at 42.3 dBA, the D15 was at 43.9, and that's not really that noticeable to people, but the Assassin 3 was using significantly slower fans, yet a louder noise level at 46 dBA. This has the AK620 as markedly more efficient than the Assassin, but similar to the D15. And this is also where liquid coolers often hold an advantage, their efficiency. They are far more efficient at a given noise level, and so can be reduced in speed to maintain the same temperature target and a much quieter noise level. Wrapping up then, in comparison to other coolers we've tested, the Deepcool AK620 actually does really well in the testing. This is why we're excited about some of the coolers we have coming up for review, because I haven't looked through all the data yet, but Mike has already collected most of the data for a $21 air cooler that's actually looking very promising. He's also looked at another dual tower, dual fan cooler in the $40 to $50 range that's promising. So we'll have those reviews coming up, but it looks like right now is a pretty good time to get into air coolers at the high end. They're finally starting to become more affordable, and some of that's probably because of volume. So for the AK620, it's within margin of error of some of the other dual towers, like the NH-D15, sometimes the FUMA2, sometimes depending on the test conditions. It's never worse in any meaningful way outside of error. It is sometimes better at 2 to 3 degrees advantaged over the other dual tower coolers we've looked at the for the products that we've recommended, like the FUMA2 and in the past the D15, and 35 dBA testing, so noise normalized testing where everything is on an equal playing field except they have their own fans included. That testing has the Deepcool AK620 doing well also. For pricing, at $65 or $70, we do think this is actually very worth considering. The direct alternative you should look at would be the Scythe FUMA2. Between them, you're probably choosing somewhat on whatever you perceive the brand credibility of each company to be, but also on the looks. And beyond that, there's not a lot of differences that really, truly matter. Now, if you're looking at this and you mostly find it for the $90 scalped price that we briefly saw online, then it's a hard pass. It is not worth that much money. There's a reason the MSRP is $30 below that, and you shouldn't really be paying that much. At $90, you're so close to good liquid coolers at $97 for, say, as an example, an EKAIO 240, that the liquid coolers start to make more sense because you can run them at a lower noise level for a given thermal result, and you end up with a more efficient cooler. Or you can just run the EKAIO at full tilt and obviously have more headroom for your thermals. So we wouldn't do this at $90. The FUMA2 at $60 would make far more sense if this is $90, just to let everyone know that. There are other factors outside of performance to consider. One of them would be ongoing support. So Noctua has really earned its name here, where as the coolers age, it has done a phenomenal job at supplying mounting brackets for those coolers as new sockets come out, like LGA 1700 whatever's up next from all of the companies. So that's something to consider here. Now, Deepcool currently does provide mounting kit upgrades for at least the coolers we've looked at recently. And like Noctua, it offers them for free, or if you can't prove you've purchased the cooler, there's no proof of purchase, you pay a couple bucks for the mounting kit and the shipping, which is also not bad, honestly. So we do like to see that. It's important because these things, coolers, they don't really go bad. As we've said before, it's just metal and then some fans, which are easily replaceable if they happen to die, and that's the only thing that might die, and they generally don't. So it's great to see companies support them going forward, because it just produces unnecessary waste for your wallet and also just waste period if they're getting replaced because a company doesn't want to update the mounting bracket. We can't review the future. We don't know if they'll keep doing that. Don't know if Deepcool will maintain that program, but for now they have it. The little bit of marketing claims that we did kind of look at were interesting. So talk about the convex cold plate design. This is something that companies typically do if they're working on a higher end cooler, where they'll try to map the curvature or the concavity of the cold plate to the expected curvature or concavity of an IHS. Intel and AMD both curve their IHSs slightly, and so mapping it is not new, but in this instance, it's really easy to see it in our pressure testing results, so that's kind of cool as well. So overall, the mounting system's easy to use. It provides a secure mount, and we didn't have any problems with it, really. The pricing is good if you get it at MSRP. Value is very competitive. It is definitely worth considering over a FUMA2, or if you can't get one or the other, either choice would be completely fine. And the build quality we think is good on this one. So, Deepcool, welcome back to the not shady side of the market. Why don't you stick around here a while, because this is a much better look for the company. They've even gotten rid of their old logo, the two-faced one. Like literally, it was two faces. It was like a little bit mixture of duplicitous and creepy looking. New logo is much more befitting of Deepcool if it sticks with the straightforward approach. Anyway, looking good here. We'll look at some more Deepcool products, and we have a couple of other reviews for coolers coming up as well. So subscribe for that as always. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly, or patreon.com/gamersnexus for some behind the scenes videos, including some about our noise, thermal, and other testing in the lab. We'll see you all next time.